My name is Teresa Ghilarducci. I'm an economics professor at the New School. I also direct the Retirement Equity Lab that you're going to be hearing quite a lot about. Our work at the university in our center is focused on the very fast coming retirement crisis. And we are working to document that crisis, what it means for people at all income levels and all other demographic groups. But we also work to propose solutions so we can define the problem. We spent a lot of time defining how the problem came to be, and we have a couple of solutions to the problem, including a proposal that the AARP gave us an award for to innovate an aspect of Social Security. So thank you. At RELAB, that you'll find today that our research is documenting the failing retirement system not only in the United States, but in many important areas in the United States, including New York. As you will see, you will find that many New Yorkers are unprepared for retirement. By some measures, most working New Yorkers are unprepared for retirement. One of the reasons is because only 42% of people who are working in New York State are even covered by any type of employee retirement system, not just defined benefit plans, but a 401k plan or a 403b, any other type of plan. It's just not available for a full 42% of people who are working now. The lack of coverage, the poor investment options, and the really immature way that people can deaccumulate the wealth that they do accumulate means that, according to our research, that hundreds of thousands of people who live in New York State will be downwardly mobile. They were once middle class or more, and we project that they will be falling into poverty or near poverty when they reach retirement. And not only is that a humanitarian crisis, it also will be a political crisis. So let me set the table for what we're going to do tonight. We will, with my colleague Mike Papadopoulos, present our data just to lay the groundwork and the framework for the kind of problems we have. And then we're going to have a discussion with three people that represent very different parts of our community. And this panel will provide the insight on the way that the retirement crisis will affect different pockets of New Yorkers. We will talk about, or I suspect they will talk about, the development of disparities over our working life and how that carries into retirement. But mainly, I want to thank the vision of AARP, not only your vision, but your hard work and the amazing staff that you have, Beth Finkel, and introduce my comrade in arms, the state director for AARP for the great state of New York. Beth, it's yours.
Good evening, everyone. Well, thank you, Teresa. I was going to do a shout out to your staff and my staff because I think they all did an exceptional job, and you're going to hear more in a little bit about all the research that they've done. So we launched Disrupt Disparities in January of this year. AARP has looked at 50 plus, both in New York and across the country, and it's clear, as Teresa was saying, this is not an even playing field at all. If you're a person of color, you are much more likely not to have the same amount of savings when you go into retirement and to be much more reliant on Social Security. So when we looked at Disrupt Disparities, we were looking actually in three areas: health, livable communities, and economic security. And when we called up the NAACP, the Urban League, the Hispanic Federation, and the Asian American Federation, and we said, nobody is unified looking at this through that perspective, through the lens of the three ethnicities of African Americans, Hispanic, and Asian American Pacific Islander through the 50 plus, and looking at it across all the different areas that these discrepancies, disparities, injustices, and inequities are just worse than we've ever seen before, or, well, maybe worse than we've seen in the last 100 years. I shouldn't say worse than we've never seen before. Now, tonight we're going to drill down in the area of economic security. We're so thrilled to be able to partner with the New School. I know Teresa talked about me, but I have to take a moment and talk about her because she really is a model for going out and fighting for people to make sure that the right research is there to be able to prove the case, to get the right policy in place, and that is not an easy thing to do. And her staff is just miraculous, and thank you, Mike, absolutely so. Please take a bow later when you come up and you share the research. So let me just talk a little bit about why we got so mobilized about this, and you all might know some of these facts already, and if you do, shout them out. New York State has the distinction of being the #1 state in the country for income discrepancy. So the top 1% of earners in New York State, you ready, top 1%, make 45 times what the next 99 make altogether. It's just shocking. And when you think about what that means, when you think about communities of color and how the demographics are shifting among communities of color and how so many people in the communities of color are struggling to save for retirement, you can see, and I hate to use this word, but it's true, you can see that this tsunami is coming forward to grip us all. The New York State communities of color account for over 60% of New York City's 50-plus population. And at the same time, New York State's population of 60-plus people of color grew by 43% between 2000 and 2010. And that represents over 5 times the growth of white 60-plus, which grew at an 8% rate. So that's over 20% times of the overall state growth. The overall state growth in population was 2.1, and it was over 20 times that for people of color. So you can see that there's a huge shift coming along. And while at the same time, people 49 and younger have declined in New York State by 6% between 2000 and 2015. Whereas the 50-plus population has grown by 30%. And that's a good thing, right, in a way, because many older people actually are comfortable, and they're a great boost to our economy, the longevity economy, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. But we have to make sure there's an even playing field out there for everyone, because we don't want the next generations to come along and not be prepared to be able to pay for their own retirement. I know Teresa already mentioned about private sector employees not being able to save for their retirement through the workplace. Pensions, very few people have pensions anymore. 401ks, we know, are not being offered as much as they have been in the past. And actually, when you drill down on this among multicultural populations, it's even more staggering, because for Hispanics, over 2/3 of Hispanics who work for a private sector do not have an option to save for their retirement in the workplace. Over 2/3. So what are we setting these people up for in terms of how they can age with dignity? And white New Yorkers' retirement income is nearly double that of New Yorkers from communities of color. So we have made some great progress. Governor Cuomo and the state legislature approved Secure Choice this past year, which is a state-facilitated retirement plan that will be optional for employers to offer to their employees. But I think you all need to hear that word optional because we don't know what the participation rate will be. We had hoped that it would have been a mandate, and maybe in future years we'll see that. But right now, it's optional. So we really believe that Secure Choice will help. It's a big step forward for New Yorkers, and we really can't thank the governor enough for his leadership here. But tonight, we want to talk about additional ways that we can help New Yorkers achieve a really secure retirement. So thank you for all joining us tonight, and I get the opportunity to introduce my mentor, who's coached me all through this, who is ARP's national expert on all state policy. We have 53 state offices. I know you can guess the 50 states. Who can guess those other 3 state offices? Anybody? Puerto Rico. Hello. Let's not forget Puerto Rico. Virgin Islands and Washington, D.C., which is still a little shocking, right? No, we haven't taken care of Guam. Maybe, Elaine, maybe you could take care of that for us. Okay, so anyway, Elaine is in charge of all state policy for all of those 53 state offices, and she was the person who really propelled Secure Choice forward, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention Jerry Madrid Davis, who's sitting next to her, so please raise your hand. And Jerry was actually the mastermind of this policy, so we thank you so much, Jerry. And Elaine, may I ask you to come up for a moment, please? Thank you.
Thank you. And by the way, we do have members in Guam, so we just don't have an office there yet. So I'm happy to go there as the emissary. Look, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you here tonight. And I'm back in the city of my birth, in the state of my beginning of my professional career. And the epicenter of if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. I just want to give a shout out to Beth Finkel and her great team for making a concept a reality that will change lives for millions of New Yorkers. And when we started this idea of disrupting disparities, it really grew out of our CEO, Joanne Jenkins' book, which is entitled Disrupt Aging. And she said that we need to disrupt aging in this country so that all can choose how they live as they age. And we know that there have been decades of disparities that millions of Americans have experienced throughout their lifetimes. Predatory lending, unbanked, no retirement savings, high interest mortgage rates, and more that have really eaten away at the economic promise that millions of people in multicultural communities have experienced. And so Beth and I discussed a way that we might be able to launch an effort to disrupt disparities. New York is our first state office to launch this effort to look across the state to determine who have experienced disparities, what do those gaps look like? But more important, I think, what are the policy solutions, the advocacy changes that together we can drive that can start to close those gaps? And while our focus at ARP has long been focused on people aged 50 years and older, we know that disparities and discrimination is an insidious force that starts at birth in communities. And so for us, it's to be ageless in this effort to make sure that if we can disrupt disparities for people of all ages, we all can enjoy a better economic opportunity and retirement. You know, people are fond of saying, my executive vice president, for one, there's a new word for retirement in this country. It's called work. Because people simply cannot afford to retire. Just when you think it's safe, housing costs go up, healthcare costs go up, the cost of prescription drugs accelerate. There are ways that we know that we need to accumulate much more wealth and assets so that we can truly live out retirement years with dignity. And that's ARP's mission and call. I want to thank Beth for her inspired leadership. And I'm only saying that because Beth invited me here. No, I'm only saying that because it's true. You know, people can give lip service to issues around disparities. And quite frankly, ARP recognizes that many more organizations in this country have long been at the forefront of fighting disparities. ARP's proud to join that team of the NAACP and the Urban League and the Hispanic Federation and the Asian Pacific Federation and elected leaders because it's important not only to see the release of a report, but to also join with some power and purpose to drive change so that all New Yorkers have a safe and secure retirement. And Beth not only launched it with her team and a group of people here in January, here in December, it's your probably 15th forum that you've had around New York State to be able to talk about this issue, not the last. And I'm delighted to be here tonight with you because I'm in a New York state of mind, and as much as I can guess, it's high anxiety about how New York will live and prosper. So I look forward to the presentation, and thanks to the New School, not only for your brilliance, but for your inspiration to put policy research as an engine for change. And thanks everyone tonight.
All right, we're going to present our data. This is Mike Papadopoulos, who's a graduate student and a very trusted and valuable member of our team.
Yeah. Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. So yeah, my name is Michael Papadopoulos. I'm here to discuss. Oh,
He's a little tall.
sorry.
We'll just be.
Yeah, I'll just move over this way. So yeah, I'm going to discuss the latest figures regarding retirement plan coverage in New York State. So there's a couple main patterns in the data. So the first main pattern is that there are wide disparities in retirement plan coverage in the state between various demographic groups. Another pattern is that coverage is very low and it's declining for nearly everyone in the state, even the most privileged members of our society. And finally, if we do nothing, we're going to see massive downward mobility. 800,000 middle-class older workers in the state could become impoverished when they retire in the next 10 years. And that's a big number, we'll see. So first, I'm going to compare retirement plan coverage in the United States, the state and the city. You'll see that only 40% of workers ages 25 to 64, and these are full-time workers, have a retirement plan through their work. And that rate has fallen 4 points in the last 2 years. That's a big drop. The state is slightly above average at 42%. But in New York City, just 35% of workers, that's just a third, have a retirement plan through their job. The rate is low in New York City, and that's partially related to the high prevalence of low-income work and the public sector being a smaller share of employment in the city than the rest of the state. We'll see that's a pattern later on. But since this event is about New York State, I'm going to stick to the state, and all the following figures will be related to New York State workers as a whole. So here we are presenting the data by race. You'll notice that coverage for white workers is higher than for people of color. 12-point difference in coverage between white and Asian and Hispanic workers. You'll also notice that coverage for black workers is higher than for Asian and Hispanic workers. And this has to do with black workers being more likely to be in public sector jobs where coverage is very high, as we'll see later. Coverage for every group except for Hispanic workers fell by 4 percentage points in the last 2 years. Again, a big drop. For Hispanic workers, the rate didn't drop, but it's already very low at just 34%. That's just 1 in 3 workers having a retirement plan through their job. But for all the groups here that are presented here, coverage just isn't where it needs to be to facilitate adequate incomes in retirement. And so now we'll look at the data by income. Here we're cutting it by the top 10% of earners, that's $115,000 a year and higher. The next 40%, and then the rest are earning below median, which is $41,000. So if you were a worker earning above median just 2 years ago, you were more likely than not to have a retirement plan through your job. As you can see, 58% had. Now, not so much. As you can see, the rate for the top 10% of earners fell by 9 percentage points in just 2 years. And for the next 40%, it fell by 4 percentage points. Another interesting finding here is that the middle group has higher coverage than the top 10%. Again, that is related to public sector jobs and unions. But another factor is the self-employed. The self-employed are very likely to be in the high income group, and just 10 or 15% of them claim a retirement plan through their job. You can see that in the full report. So I've mentioned throughout what seems to be the biggest driver of having a retirement plan through your job is being either in a public sector job or in a union job. And we'll see the figures for that right now. So as you can see here, the coverage for public sector and union jobs is nearly double that for non-union and private sector jobs, over 70%. And the gap is widening. If you look at the union figures, the union coverage rate fell by 3 points, and for the non-union workers, it fell by 6 points. So as that's indicating a widening gap in coverage. What's really important to note here is that public sector jobs and union jobs are the most important, or the worker's best bet to get a retirement plan through their work. So one would want to pursue these jobs, but both public sector jobs and union jobs are declining as a share of employment. Union density is falling. So that explains why coverage could be falling for everyone, as we saw before. So just as a side note, I haven't presented the numbers for a gender gap in coverage, but that's because there isn't much of one. If anything, coverage for women has been higher for men historically. And that's, again, mostly to do with women being more likely to be in public sector and union jobs, especially education, where coverage is very high. You can see the figures for that in the full report as well. So why do we care about retirement plan coverage? It's because workers cannot really save for retirement if they don't have a retirement plan through their job. IRAs do exist, but the type of people who have IRAs are also the ones who are going to have 401ks through their job anyway. And this is reflected in our retirement savings figures, which you'll see here. So these are the median 401k and IRA combined balances for workers ages 55 to 64 in the state. As you can see, the median for everyone in this group is just $18,000. And that's wealth, that's not income. So that's an amount of money a retired person is going to have to make do with for their entire retired lives. So it really doesn't amount to much at all. And if you're earning below the median income, you're more likely than not to have nothing saved for retirement. So you'll be completely reliant on Social Security, which is not enough. Even if you look at the top 10%, they have $225,000 saved, but that can maybe maintain their living standard for 3 or 4 years tops. Again, not nearly enough. So one thing is that we can't present this data by race because we have sample size limitations, but if you just infer that lower coverage means more likely to not have any retirement savings, if you were to make this table for people of color, the numbers would be even lower than they are here, and even this is pretty desperate situation. So what's important to note here is that if you don't have any retirement savings, which a lot of people don't have any, and even the ones that do don't have enough, you are faced with two choices, right? You either can delay retirement, work longer, and hope, hey, maybe I'll save up enough to retire later. For most people that won't work, these are people aged 55 to 64, so they're already near retirement age. They're not likely to catch up, and especially is not an option for people who are in declining health at these ages. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're not really able to save anyway. So the other option, which is the one that most people will be forced into, is to retire and to accept a declining living standard. And that's what we call downward mobility. So what this table is showing is that in New York State, there are around 2 million people in their 50s that are middle class or above. Of those 2 million, over 800,000 are expected to be poor or near the poverty line when they retire over the next 10 years. So if we do nothing to address this retirement crisis, 2 out of every 5 middle-class households will be poor or near poor when they retire. That's massive downward mobility. It's going to be politically lethal and economically damaging. Old people vote, and downward mobility cuts demand, it costs jobs, and it will add to our social spending. If older people are deprived of the ability to retire, younger people are going to feel the effects too, because they'll face greater competition for jobs, lower wages, lower bargaining power, so they're going to be affected as well. So it's important that policymakers act now to alleviate all these wide-ranging effects of our impending retirement crisis. Thank you very much.
Just remarks to introduce the panel. Is it used to be that with defined benefit plans and Social Security, we saw Americans coming closer together when they retired. Income distribution and wealth distribution shrank a bit and alleviated the disparities that were developed over a life course and over in the labor market. But now with the disappearance of defined benefit plans and the rise of nothing, because the 401k type plan, the revolution, did not do what it had promised to do, which was to expand coverage. We have a system where we have widening disparities in retirement. So we don't think that a system should fix all the disparities, but to make it worse is a step in the wrong direction. Now, secure choice was a good step towards solving the coverage problem, but a decent retirement plan has to do more than just cover people. It has to take every dollar that a person puts into the retirement plan into a professionally managed system. We don't get that with do-it-yourself, voluntary, commercial-based systems. And as we see now, when people are hitting retirement age, people have to have a way to turn that money into a lifelong benefit. And the 401k system, including the secure choice, won't help people solve that problem too. And those parts of the design, the voluntary aspect of it, the poor investment options, and the disparities we'll see in who has availability to a financial advisor they can trust, who has availability to someone they can't trust, who has no one at all, is going to create not only this downward mobility, but more extreme disparities in our society. So I hope this is the beginning, that we can take the secure choice plan and improve it so that we see a shrinking of disparities in one of the most crucial parts of our life, which is the end of our working lives. Thank you. So now I would like to invite the panel to the table, please. And No, we'll let the people introduce themselves. Right. But I would like to introduce my colleague and a famous personality, Helene Olen, who is a noted financial journalist. She writes for the Washington Post now. Her book, Pound Foolish, is one of the best and funniest books in personal finance. She also debuted on the Stephen Colbert Show. It was fantastic.
It was
it was the other one.
the other one, Jon
It was
Stewart.
Jon Stewart's show. Right. So thank you, ladies.
Thanks. So I have to just tell the story quickly about going on the Jon Stewart show, which, as I always say, was really funny after it was all over. But I am 4'11", as anybody could probably tell, and nobody had ever seen Jon Stewart tower over a guest before. So I literally got several dozen emails the next day asking me how tall I was. So anyhow, on that note, this is a really great panel, and I should say one of the reasons I'm really happy to do this is because the other day I was on Facebook, of course, and there's a private listserv for middle-aged women on there that has a gazillion members, and somebody mentioned, you know, I'm 63 and divorced, and I need financial help. And there are literally hundreds of responses to this, and they range from everything from find a great fiduciary advisor to one person suggested some famous gold bug advisor. Other people suggested their advisor who wasn't charging them anything at all, but was giving great advice. And it was just all over the place. So I want to say this is really needed. So anyhow, we have this terrific panel here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because I, of course, do not have their biographies up here, so I will miss something if I do it by memory. And the other thing I need to say before I let them go is there are index cards around the room. There are people who are going to distribute them. And if you have questions, you should fill them out. I will remind you again a few minutes before the panel, our part of the panel ends, so that then I will read them out loud and I will ask the questions for you. So on that note, whoever wants to go first and...
Yep. Hi, my name is Joanne Yu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. We are an umbrella convener of about 70 nonprofit organizations that serve the New York City's Asian American community. I just had one of those, for the last couple of weeks, I've just had one of those. Every day was one of those days. So today I came here and I thought, I'm going to have a little glass of wine. What could go wrong? Well, I'm feeling kind of warm, so I'm going to give you all the unfiltered version stuff today. So thanks for inviting me, Beth.
Hi, I'm Vinny Alvarez. I'm president of the New York City Central Labor Council, AFL-CIO. So New York City Central Labor Council, AFL-CIO, is we at the AFL-CIO have about 500 organizations throughout the state. We have 50 state organizations, obviously, and about 400 and they always change it, but about 425, 450 organizations throughout the country. We're the largest regional labor federation of the AFL-CIO throughout the country. We represent about 300 unions here in the city, 1.3 million workers collectively, from the public sector unions to the private sector unions of various trades to the construction trade unions as well. So thanks for having me. Oh, you want to use that?
Hello, everybody. My name is Alexis Iwanisziw. I'm the Deputy Director of New Economy Project. We're a nonprofit organization based in New York City, and we work with community groups from all around the 5 boroughs to organize coalitions and campaigns to fight for racial and economic justice and build an economy that works for all. And we also were really pleased to work with AARP on the Disrupting Disparities Economic Security Report, and so I'll be talking a lot about that tonight with you.
Okay, I'm going to just plunge in with questions. The first one is everybody here represents a different community, labor, advocacy, residents of New York City. All of these communities are suffering from issues with retirement, preparedness, and readiness. And so what I would ask is if each person could take a moment to tell me about your experiences with retirement security and what the communities you represent need most from reform, and whoever wants to start.
Well, I had a wine, so I should start. So I really appreciate this conversation because I think anytime I get a chance to talk about the challenges in our community, you know, it's really important for us to be educated. Asian American seniors are, Asian American community is the fastest growing in the city. We're over 15%. Asian American seniors are the poorest senior population in New York. And so when we talk about retirement, I will say that speaking for the seniors that my member agencies work with, we're not even at this point of talking about secure choice or retirement because so many of them don't have access to any kind of security. I can't tell you the number of phone calls that I get in a month where somebody says, elected official will say, "Do you have $400 so that we can help somebody pay for rent because there's no way they're going to make it?" And we scramble around to make calls to see who actually has that money. Um, part of I think when we talk about what is happening in the political climate, I will say that having immigrants, the immigrant community is really impacted. Asian Americans, 70% of Asian Americans are immigrants, which means that a lot of the seniors who came here, they had to work. And, if you don't speak the language, you don't get the high paying jobs. And so you work in underground economy, you work in low wage jobs, so you don't have retirement. You're basically living paycheck to paycheck. So telling people about, are you saving for a retirement? That is not a conversation that we have with the members that we work with. The other part of the conversation, when a lot of the seniors in our community, when they are able to save a little bit, their retirement plan was always to go back home to their native country. Whether they're green card holders or citizens, they always said I want to go home and retire because things are cheaper. I have my community there. Well, for various reasons, politics, or they've grown accustomed to living in New York, they don't want to go home, which means that all their money that they've sent home to build an infrastructure at home, that is not something that they can tap into. So I think our communities really, and the challenge with our community also is that we don't speak one language. There are many languages we speak. There's so much diversity, and all the immigration histories come into play. So I'm happy to participate in this conversation, but like I said, I think for us, this is not, for so many of the seniors that we work with, this is not a conversation that we can even have with them. We can't even broach the subject for the fact that they can barely eat. I met Beth having to talk about food disparities and having to talk about how many of our seniors go hungry. Last Friday, we had to do a special presentation with the city to talk about what the president's proposed public charge rule looks like and how many of our seniors are going to be impacted. We have all our member agencies are coming to tell us, people are coming to our centers to beg us to get them disenrolled because they're afraid of what the immigration consequences are going to be, right? So when you think about that, I want to put this on Beth to say, Beth, we need to have this food conversation, because if people are saying, I can't take any services because I'm afraid to be deported, even though they're perfectly eligible to receive this, what is going to happen to this very, very precarious system that is holding all of these vulnerable seniors, they're just on that precipice. And I think it's really scary for those of us who are doing this frontline work.
Thank you, Joanne. And let me thank, and neglected, to thank, of course, AARP and the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy for hosting this. It's really important topic. We have been at the AFL-CIO in New York City here, working with Teresa now for several years on this issue. If you saw the statistics, I talked earlier about the 1.3 million unionized workers here in New York City, but if you see the statistics, we're fortunate that, like myself, who's been a union member for 28 years, 70% of us have access to some form of retirement plan, as opposed to, I used to say 59%, but now it's up to 65%. It's a really staggering number of how many New Yorkers have access to nothing. And this has been, for several, this has been a problem which has been in the making for a long time. It's a slow motion crisis, not entirely unlike a lot of other crises that we see and that we deal with in society. And it's tough sometimes to get people to focus in on a crisis that it just gets incrementally worse each and every year. Because quite often I think a lot of politicians and other folks and policymakers, they live in 2- and 4-year increments. And this is a crisis that needs a holistic and a comprehensive approach, given the magnitude of how severe the problem is, based upon the data that we continue to see and the direction that we continue to see with the diminishment of retirement security throughout the country. But when it comes to union members, one of the themes that we keep at the AFL-CIO talking about over the years is this correlation between a voice at work, power in the workplace, and your ability to fight for something like adequate retirement security in the workplace, so that when you get to retirement age and you have certain levels of protection in the workplace, you don't have to make that decision, well, am I going to work until I die or am I going to have to retire into poverty? And that is something that we want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can, certainly for the members who belong to unions here in the city, but we also want to work with our advocates and allies throughout society to make sure that we could protect a worker's voice at work and hopefully establish some balance of power that they could have to have access to adequate retirement security in the workplace, but then also make sure that we are continuing to strengthen and protect the plans that we have in place for these 1 million plus New Yorkers here, because we know how important that is. We understand how much of a catastrophe that this is and a burden that this is going to become on local municipalities as we move forward, the economic problems that it's going to cause for some societies, and how eventually we're all going to have to deal with this one way or the other. I say quite often we have climate deniers out there in society, and we have retirement security deniers as well. We have a major problem that we may need to, all of us, I think, come together, and I'm glad that we're doing this, to talk about not only the crisis, but a call to action on how maybe we can address those, analyzing certainly in the workplace where some things that have taken place in some workplaces, like we said, in the unionized workplaces, where people are 2 times as likely to have a retirement security, and why there are certain conditions in other workplaces where people don't have that option, and maybe things that we could do to change that.
Great. So I'd like to share some findings from the research that we've done and really put in context how bad things are for so many people, and particularly New Yorkers of color, with respect to retirement now and what that could look like in the future. So looking at just working with our partners and doing interviews and learning from groups around the city about what did their members' retirements look like, what we heard was, more often than not, people were living on just Social Security, which tracks very cleanly with the research that the New School presented tonight, where people have no retirement savings on average. But then when you look deeper and look at, how much money do Latino New Yorkers have or Black New Yorkers have, we found that Latino New Yorkers had 61 cents on the dollar compared to white New Yorkers of retirement income, and Black New Yorkers just 71 cents on the dollar, which is really shocking. And then when you zoom into New York City, and to Joanne's point, looking at New Yorkers who are immigrants and who maybe came to this country later and didn't have as much time to work and pay into the Social Security system, we found that Asian New York City residents were getting about 40% of the Social Security income as white New York City residents. Latino residents were at about 60%, and Black New Yorkers were at about 80% of what white New York City residents were getting in Social Security. So even looking at, okay, there's Social Security, that's there for you, there are still huge racial and ethnic disparities in that universe as well. So this is just an enormous problem. And so when we've been thinking about how do we address these problems, obviously there are a lot of solutions focusing on retirement, but we wanted to take a step back today and talk also about some of the bigger, more structural problems facing our economy. Why are people not able to save for retirement? Why are these racial disparities such an issue? And so we know that how people's incomes and savings are shaking out in retirement are reflecting an economic system that we have that is beset with structural racism, that our housing system is very often extractive, that people are paying more than 50% of their income on housing, that banks and financial services companies do not serve communities of color equitably and extract wealth from them, and we can talk a lot more about the financial crisis and the role that that's played as well, along with myriad issues in employment opportunity as well. So we also want to focus on how do we transform our economy so that we're not facing those problems in the future. So focusing on building community wealth, ending predatory lending, and making sure that there's good quality affordable housing available as well would all go a long way.
I actually want to follow up on one thing you mentioned in there, because I think it's a really interesting point. How is housing impacting retirement preparedness?
Yeah, so one thing that we found in the research that we did was that in New York State, homeowners of color were twice as likely to be severely housing cost burdened than white New Yorkers. So what does that mean? Severely housing cost burden means that you pay more than half of your income on housing. It's going right to your, mortgage and taxes and housing payment. And what's generally considered affordable is about 30%. So you're paying an enormous extra chunk of your income every month just to maintain your housing. And that, again, was a huge problem for New Yorkers of color who were targeted for high-cost predatory loans during the subprime mortgage crisis, who were denied equitable access to mortgage modifications to work out those loans and stay in their homes, and who disproportionately lost enormous amounts of wealth through the foreclosure crisis as well. But those people who hung on and stayed in their homes are still, to this day, cost burdened, and that is an enormous chunk of money that's not available for them to meet other needs, including saving for retirement.
Can I answer that? So
Yeah,
in the
go
Asian
ahead.
American community, there's this, we call it hidden homelessness. You think everybody has a home, but the fact is that there are maybe 4 or 5 seniors living together. You don't think that they're homeless, but one person has their lease, and then they have other people joining them, and that's how they're making their ends meet. So we hear all kinds of stories about roommate abuse, theft. I can be the person holding the lease, and I have 3 roommates, and I might say, if you don't give me extra money this month, I'm gonna call somebody and get you in trouble, right? There's all of this activity happening, illegal, underground, sad, but this is the reality that we live in. And so, when we look at, I ask there are about 10 groups that work with seniors, and I ask them, what is the one issue that we can all work on together? Everybody says, can we figure out how to build affordable housing? I don't really know when the last time we actually built any affordable housing in New York City. And all of those are actually distributed by lottery. So, one of our member agencies, Asian Americans for Equality, for instance, they build affordable housing. They have 200 units, and then you get like some crazy number, I'm not exaggerating, like 60,000 applications. So, seniors have, feel the pressure of this housing, the lack of affordable housing, but so does everybody else, right? And so I think when we talk about, not having access to resources to even cover basic costs, I think, this is where we really have a serious problem in our city.
And is this an issue in the Latino community as well? Or
Well, I can't speak specifically to the Latino community, but I can tell you that when I was briefly looking at some of the data, it seems like there is a correlation across most of the lower income and various minority communities as well that we're seeing this. But it's interesting because we're here to talk about the crisis of retirement security. So when we talk about retirement, we're talking about a culmination of life's work and a culmination of hopefully earnings and savings and the other things which are going to go into hopefully you having a life, a retirement with dignity and one that you could live with a minimum amount of public assistance and other forms of assistance from family members. And when you see the high cost of housing, when you see the high cost of health care out there, with wage stagnation that we've seen now for 30 years or better, the high cost of student debt that so many students and even parents like myself, I quite often say I never had a student debt when I went to college, and I now have student loans because I wanted to. It was a choice that I had. Thankfully, I was able to help my 2 college-age students, one who's out, but that is a huge burden. And with the attack on collective bargaining and an attack on workers' rights in the workplace, leading to the diminishment of retirement security, this crisis is becoming compounded on so many different levels. So there's really, I think we have to take a holistic approach on how we're going to really try to find some solutions to it. And the one thing which we didn't mention is Social Security, because we're huge supporters certainly in the labor movement and we want to continue to make sure that we support Social Security, but it is far below the level. The income replacement rate of Social Security, we know, is far below what is needed for people also to retire with dignity.
I want to come back to Social Security in a few minutes. That's actually on my list here. But I want to ask a question about secure choice. But before I do, how many people in the audience actually know what secure choice is? Okay, how many don't? And be honest. Okay, does somebody want to explain it? Any?
What's that?
You've been nominated.
I've been nominated. You know, Secure Choice Plan was recently passed by the state government and New York State government. We've had about 10 plans now throughout the country that different plans. Some plans have passed mandatory plans. This is a form of an optional plan that the state had passed, and it was essentially, I almost describe it as, I'm not an expert on the plan, but it's like a My IRA, almost essentially what we had passed. I think originally what we were trying to do in New York State is pass a plan that maybe was going to be able to afford people with a greater level of retirement security and a greater, I think, not an opportunity, but an obligation certainly on the part of some of the employers throughout the state. But it's a plan that we have. It's a mandatory plan, and with the current White House right now, excuse me, not a mandatory plan, it's an optional plan with the current White House right now and the rescinding of some of the regulations that they've had, that actually is something that I think is going to be helpful for us. Is it going to be a help? Absolutely. Because right now, if you go in the workplace, many of the people, they don't have a 401k. There's so many small employers that don't have any willingness to put together a plan. I know it's costly for a lot of employees. We've heard that from employees that we talked to. We've mentioned there's 70% of union members that have it, but a lot of union members don't have it as well, and smaller employers don't have it. So it gives them the opportunity to use essentially the infrastructure of the state government, help put together a retirement security plan and a form of savings that they would not otherwise have. So I think the state plan is certainly helpful. I think the city plan, the state plan is one that is something that's going to be helpful, certainly to workers throughout the state, but we need to do a lot more. And in order to make sure that we're making up for income replacement that is certainly a lot lower than it's going to need to be if they're going to be able to address all the issues that we talked about.
Are employers going to have to tell employees about secure choice, or will they, or is it voluntary?
I don't believe that there's any mandatory reporting requirements about it. So essentially, if you go into the workplace, you don't have a 401k, we have a system now through Secure Choice where the state government is setting up a plan, and they could participate in the plan. But it is an optional plan, and it's certainly going to be a help for folks who have nothing right now in those workplaces.
It's not
Yeah, somebody could just talk for 1 second. Tell me more.
quickly, but there are actually experts in the room on this, so I'm kind of embarrassed that I'm the one up here, but here you go. Jump in, those people in the second row there, you know who you are. So basically, what we were saying before is that there are 3.5 million New Yorkers who go to work every day in private sector and don't have a place to automatically save for their retirement. You work in a place that has a pension or a 401k. Every week, out of your paycheck comes that money, and people are more likely to save for their retirement if money automatically comes out of their paycheck. You know, you budget for it, it's over. You never get it in your hand, and you don't have to worry about it. What we realized, what ARP realized, and a number of other advocates, but this was our number one issue for us in New York, was that we wanted to help those 3.5 million New Yorkers be able to save for their retirement. So we asked New York State to come forward and come up with a state-facilitated plan, because just what Vinny said, employers were saying, number one, they didn't want the fiduciary responsibility of doing a plan, and number two, they didn't want the expense of having to create the plan and keep it going. The state was willing to come in and take that. What the problem is that this was passed in the Obama administration. They had DOL changed the law, the rules, to allow states to then offer a mandatory state-facilitated retirement plan that companies would then be mandated to participate in, and employees would be automatically enrolled in. They could opt out if they didn't want to participate. With the new administration coming in, those rules were stopped. And so at that point, New York State had not started working on the Secure Choice Plan. And so in the end, New York State's plan became optional rather than mandatory. So everyone knows the current political climate. There's opportunities down the road. We're hoping that one day there will be mandatory coverage. In the meantime, Illinois, California, a number of other states do have that mandatory plan. They're going to be going to court against the federal administration to try to make sure they can keep that for their workers. And in the meantime, there are a number of states that have passed what we've passed. There are a number of states still working on it. And we almost had it in New York City, actually. Thank you to this man down here, but that didn't quite work out with the new federal rules, but who knows, one day. So I hope I answered the question.
Yes.
Okay.
And when does it start for people?
Well, that's a good question. So they're putting together a commission. There'll be 7 members of the commission. It should be starting very soon. And then it takes 2-3 years to get it up and running. They've got to pick what financial company will run the money, et cetera, get all the rules and regulations in place, and then we'll be up and running.
So basically, maybe if we're all lucky, we'll have a Democratic administration by then that can make it mandatory again for us. I know you did not say that. I write for an opinion page. Anyhow, okay. So how would this help the communities you guys represent, if somebody would like to give a quick answer? Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge of the communities that we work in, they don't necessarily, there's a plan now, right? Like if they want to contribute, they can. I will say though that the folks that my member agencies work with, they barely, can cover their daily costs. So they're all low-wage workers. So even if there's a plan in place, how many people will participate? That's going to be really interesting. I hope the state will continue to, will track those numbers, because I think we do need to figure out a solution. But I will say, if you tell a low-wage worker, somebody who's working in the restaurant, like, oh, there's this plan that you can chip into, pay into it, they're going to be, they're going to look at you and say, what are you talking about, right? I can barely cover my rent and food, and there is no way that I can, retirement is not something that we think about. So I think those are the realities of the folks that we work with.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it just really underscores the need to push for living wage jobs, union jobs, work that actually pays enough to allow people to save. And I mean, as that happens and we start being able to address the racial wealth gap, that's something else that we really need to be focusing on in this context, that lots of people are starting out, particularly white Americans, with inherited wealth. And so when you look at some of the statistics for New York, we have enormous, not just income inequality, as Beth mentioned, that top 1% that she was talking about takes home almost a third of all the income in the entire state. But we also have enormous wealth inequality, where Latino households in New York have about 3% of the wealth of white households. Black households have about 6% of the wealth, and Asian households have about 21% of the wealth. And to be clear, Asian households, there's a very big split between people who are very poor and have very little wealth, and then a smaller subset of people who are better off. So on average, the picture can be a little confusing there. But that's just another huge barrier to secure retirement, where certain people are starting out far ahead of everybody else.
Again, as I said, most of the union members are fortunate to have a traditional defined benefit pension plan, which replaces the replacement rates of traditional defined benefit pension plans as opposed to defined contribution plans is substantially higher and substantially better, and why we continue to protect and defend those occupations that have those. one of the main issues of a major dispute which is taking place throughout the city right now with a 20-month long strike against Charter Spectrum, a company that makes billions of dollars literally in revenue every year, and has a CEO that makes $300,000 a day, literally a day, is all over the pension. It's all over the pension. And say, well, we'll give them a 401k, we'll give them a defined contribution plan. But the reason why I think that we take such a hardline stance is because when you have a choice between a traditional defined contribution plan versus traditional defined benefit pension plan versus defined contribution plan, we know that it is significantly going to be much more advantageous for workers to have a more traditional defined benefit plan with regard to retirement security. So they're good. There's no question about it. Secure choice, these other plans which are taking place, because some of these workers have nothing right now, which is really bad. And we're pleased that we absolutely that they have them, but we want to make sure that we're also focusing on something that's going to be adequate enough for all the different workers that are out there dealing with this crisis.
Okay. So, one of the things that always occurs to me is that when we talk about retirement planning, we usually end up hearing from the most well-off people, right? People like in the past, say, week, for example, people have been obsessing about 401ks and the stock market, right? How do we reach out to people, who are in communities of color, women, lower income, and get them to understand the urgency of the problem and, get them to participate on their own in something like this, if they can, and second, to, help lobby for further changes?
I think one for sure is financial literacy. I think in a lot of immigrant communities, there's so many programs out there by banks, but the reality is that there's still a huge segment of our population, the Asian American community, that's underbanked. And I want to tell Alexis, I want to out myself, Alexis, today here publicly. Somebody called me a reporter called me from CNN, and she wants to do a story about these cashless restaurants. And she said, what do you think? And I said, oh my God, it's like the most classist thing ever. And you know who's going to back me up? God, that organization. But I think it goes to the fact that, like, what does that look like? Like, even something like, these fancy restaurants, you have to have a credit card to come and eat there, right? And I'm thinking, half the people in my community, there are seniors who keep their money under the mattress, right? So when we see these fires, somebody says, oh my God, my entire life savings went up in a coffee can that was kept under my mattress. Like, we hear those stories a lot. We need to be able to provide financial information. We need to be able to reach out to people. I cannot tell you how many times we've always said, it is just like the thing that I say constantly, like, can we have some language access? Can we have like cultural competency? And can we move beyond competency? Can we move beyond like having some level of expertise? We live in New York City, where we are people who look like me, people who look like all of us in this room. We are everywhere. Yet I cannot tell you how many times the information that people need, the basic information, is not translated. It is not relayed. And so, if you don't have materials that speak to you, that reach out to you, then you're left out. The other part of that is, nothing. The best way to inform people is to actually go and talk to people. There are all of these community organizations. I can't. They say like, I gave this lady a piece of paper, and X, Y, Z. And I said, like, half these people, like some of these people aren't even literate in their own language, right? We need to think about, what does education look like? How do we reach people? How do we reach real people? During Sandy relief work, I was in a neighborhood. There was a young woman, very, very young woman. I mean, she could have been my daughter. She's a new immigrant. She couldn't sign her name. She signed an X, right? So these are the things that we keep saying, we as advocates are saying, do translations, go to people, knock on doors, talk to people, but that is the information that we need. And it's not the burden of just the nonprofit organizations, but it should be the banks, the places of worship, like community centers, schools. You can't just send stuff home to, mail people documents and say, here's this information. If they can't read it, how are they supposed to know this stuff, right? So.
Yeah, and I mean, picking up on what Joanne said, certainly, there are a lot of people in New York City, particularly older people of color, who don't have bank accounts or who maybe have a savings account, but mostly do their banking at check cashers and other fringe financial services. So that's very, very common. So yes, I would agree with you there. And I also just wanted to talk about engaging with groups. That's something that we at New Economy Project take very seriously, and that's a big part of our work. And what we found in terms of engaging people in work is really having a bold, transformative vision. So it's maybe not so exciting to say you should save for retirement, but to really think about, what are the bigger picture issues in people's lives and how can we work together to address them? And so some of the work that we've been doing around building a New York State community equity agenda that addresses not just living wage and good jobs, but also supporting small businesses in communities of color, supporting community development financial institutions and credit unions that actually provide, appropriate, low-cost financial services. And these are mission-driven financial cooperatives much of the time that focus particularly on serving low-income people and people of color. And to be able to work together to support those kinds of visions, I think gets people more excited than feeling bad about not being able to save, given all of the barriers that people face.
So I wanted to come back to your push about your thoughts about Social Security for a moment. I mean, one of the things is sort of a broader question. Are these state efforts enough, or do we need to push for more other federal solutions? And if so, what are they? And I'm guessing you're going to say Social Security as part of it, but I wanted to hear what you have to say, Vinny, and what everybody else has to say on this question as well.
Well, I did tip my hand earlier about Social Security. I certainly think that that's one of the things that we have to do. I think we also have to make sure that we are funding existing defined benefit plans, because a lot of the problems, and I want to caution this by saying, defined benefit plans throughout the country, they're very different from state to state, but primarily a lot of the problems can be traced back to funding issues, not necessarily the actual plan in and of itself and the operations and how the plan and the underpinnings and the strength of the plan itself. So I would say that yes, we have to certainly look into Social Security. We have to certainly look into the income replacement rate of Social Security, but we also have to continue to support defined benefit pension plans and make sure that they are well funded throughout the country. And the third thing, and they're connected here, all of this is connected too, is we need to make sure that we strengthen collective bargaining and a voice in the workplace, because I do think that a lot of these solutions to a lot of these problems has to do with these. You still need money at the end of the day to put in the plans, and we have certainly it's helpful to make sure that we have plans in place for workers that don't have access to a plan. But when we talk about, as we opened up this panel, the list of the problems and the issues that everyday working people are facing, and the lack of, I don't know where exactly the money's going to come from at the end of the day to fund retirement. And so that is really connected to power in the workplace and this dynamic that we've seen change literally over the past 30 years, where workers and the ability for them to have some security in the retirement security in the workplace through collective bargaining and making sure that they have a voice in the workplace and a voice at work. I would say that is a key component in that. And if we do those things, including with Social Security, of course, and looking at the income replacement rate and what we have to do to make sure that it's strengthened going forward, I think that workers in future years may be in a little bit better shape.
Anyone else? Okay. I want to come back then to, I actually want to ask you one other question, follow-up question. Are there a significant number of New Yorkers impacted by the potential problems in the multi-employer plans? Do we know?
My friend John's laughing because we were just talking about that coming in. Yes, potentially. And to be continued, the Joint Committee on the Solvency for Multi-Employment Pension Plans, their work continues. I know they went through the deadline, which was last Friday, right, November 30th, and they're continuing, and we should certainly stay tuned because, as I said earlier, there's a lot of different each plan is different, and there's a lot of different issues facing different plans, and certainly some of the issues that they're dealing with the multi-employer plans as well as the PBGC. There's a lot that we're definitely going to have to pay close attention to because they could have significant impact. No question about it.
And I want to take this and the other end of the income spectrum for a moment. We've been talking a lot, obviously, partly because of the report, about the issues in communities of color and lower income communities. But the report also points out that it's not like people in the top 10% of the income spectrum are exactly in great shape. So how do we get them to be more concerned with this issue as well? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Because this should benefit them as much as anybody else, right?
I mean, I think sadly, there hasn't been nobody has sounded the alarm. Like, we're talking about it now, but, it really needs to come from every level of government. Everybody needs to talk about this. This is a huge issue. I think, this is a crisis that's happening. I will tell you, with my own friends, we have made a career in nonprofit, right? When I ask my friends, "You guys ready for retirement?" They were like, "Well, I'm gonna be dying at my desk," right? And we say that as a joke, but the reality is that is a reality for many of us. That's the reality for many professionals, and I think we don't have this conversation because we don't think about retirement, and we do need to start to have more of these town halls, Beth. You need to take this roadshow. Take this as a roadshow, but I think. Yeah, I don't think we talk about retirement. I think, I don't want to think about getting older, but, here's the reality. And, I think about my own retirement. My parents were nice enough to start a retirement for me because they said, we obviously know that, that law school education was wasted on you and you're going to spend your entire life doing, working in nonprofit. And so I'm lucky enough that somebody was thoughtful enough in my family to think about my retirement, right? But I know that is a huge luxury that so many of my peers in my industry do not have. And I think that is, so we need to start to have these conversations. But like I said, when we sit around and, all my friends are at that age when, in the next decade or so, exactly when we're gonna start to get really scared. When I say, "Are you guys ready to retire?" They said, "Oh my God, no." So I think, lots more conversation, lots more sounding the alarm from all the elected officials. Anybody who can talk about this, we need to have this conversation.
Alexis, do you have any thoughts?
No, I mean, our work is very focused on lower income people and communities that.
Okay. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Why not? There certainly has been a complete, I think, breakdown in the social compact between employers and employees in this country. And I really think that we need to, I think it's important and it's great that we continue to have these discussions, and we're having forums like this, and we've had forums like this before to talk about this one specific consequence of the breakdown between the social compact between employers and employees and the loss of power in the workplace, and we see it now with retirement security. And we've talked about this being a slow motion crisis, but the crisis now is becoming reality for so many New Yorkers and so many people around the country, and it's leading to a whole host of problems for municipalities now, and those problems are only going to accelerate and get worse in the future. So I absolutely agree. People need to be talking about this as much as they can in academia, elected officials, certainly in the labor movement we are, and in so many other forums like this.
I want to just remind everybody before I plunge in and ask my last question, one more time. There are people going around the audience with index cards. Please, if you have questions, I have loads here, but I always want more. So please, you have about 2 or 3 more minutes to get them to me. I want to ask about how the gig economy is impacting retirement savings, or how you potentially see it impacting retirement savings, because this is, in some ways, this is something that's been going on for a long time, but in other ways, it's something that seems to be accelerating on some level. And I was curious if any of you had thoughts about that.
What economy?
The gig economy.
So when we were doing this research with AARP, one of the things we did was interviews with a lot of small business lenders and community development credit unions to understand what was going on with small business owners who were 50 and older. And one of the really big findings we found was that the prevalence of the gig economy was actually creating significant barriers to economic security for people of color, particularly immigrants over 50. That people would, come to this country, think about starting a small business, like buying a car and becoming a contractor at a car service as their first step into owning their own business. And what has wound up happening now with the growth of Uber is that that business model is just closed off to people, and people who came in and, had learned from friends and family that that was a path to a stable job and income just suddenly found it was not anymore. So certainly, in terms of larger economic stability and earnings, that's been a big problem for many New Yorkers of color and immigrant New Yorkers.
I think for my community, one of the challenges will be working with, I think one of the opportunities is actually working with the small business community. We are a census information center, so we get to pump out all the research around the Asian American community. We did a report around the economic contributions, and we found that, in a period when we had this, the Great Recession from 2002 to 2012, Asian Americans created 31% of net new small businesses in the city. We created half of net new economic activity and half of net new paid employment, right? So all of these small mom and pop shops that you see, they're job creators, but that also means that they're sacrificing their own security as well, because there isn't, if you're a small shop, you're not really competing. You can create a few jobs, but really how are you able to save anything? And now more than ever, as our city becomes a big giant mall, and we're having, all of these small guys are having to compete with these big box stores, they're being driven out of business. And so where they were actually able to create jobs, to be able to, create an economy, that's going away. For the owners, small business owners, I can't tell you how many. We work with 200 small businesses in Flushing. I can't tell you how many of them are closing up shop right now and saying, I can't do this anymore, right? And I said, what's your economics, what's gonna happen? They said, we don't know. We just have to go. We can't make any money. So if a small business closes, they're losing out on creating income for themselves, but also, we're losing jobs, right? So I think a lot has happened. I think, we're looking at the numbers between 2012 and what is happening now, but so much has turned in the last few years with this administration, and I think a lot of people are going home. I think there's a lot of fear. I think these are the realities that we live under in an immigrant community. So I think one of the things that I, definitely want to see that we talk, we all share the idea of how do we create, how do we improve wages for workers? How do we improve some opportunities for the small business owners? Because there's all of these regulations that are just bearing down that, are taking money away, taking resources away. We found out yesterday that there are a handful of small business companies in New York City, sign companies in New York City that are eligible to hang commercial signs, which means that 99% of the signs that are hung around New York City are illegal. And those sign removal and creating, that's like $10,000. If you're a small mom and pop shop, where are you gonna get $10,000 to pay the fine, to be able to create a new sign? Like, everything in many ways is working against these small business owners, but what are the opportunities that we can really support them and uplift them? Korean Americans have the highest rate of uninsured kids. And, somebody asked me, why is that? Well, because they have the highest number of small businesses. And so they're not, paying for insurance for their children because they can't afford it. So I think, for every statistic somebody gives us, we have an explanation. We know what's happening in our community because we're all living it. And I think, I see a lot of nodding heads because you're experiencing this too, and we see it at every level.
Okay, I'm going to start going through these index cards. I don't think I'm going to get to all of them, so my apologies in advance. I'm going to start, actually, I'm going to take the first one, which is a basic one and something I should have asked for definitions for as well. When I was so busy getting secure choice defined, I realized I never defined, neither of any of us did, what the difference between defined contribution and defined benefit.
True.
So I'm going to explain this real quickly. Defined contribution is your self-retirement plan, or your workplace one, so your IRA, your 401k. Defined benefit is a pension, a traditional pension, right? And the second part of this question is can you explain the difference and what is better? And the answer is that the defined benefits were established initially to be a supplement for pensions. The defined contributions were defined to be part of, to supplement your defined benefit plan, sorry. You see how confusing this stuff gets right away. Nobody thought, except for a few people in this room like Teresa Ghilarducci, that they would replace the pension, right? It was supposed to be a supplement because it was thought, well, pensions aren't often large enough, or people leave their jobs and they don't collect the pension, so we'll give them this thing on the side. And of course, that's, as we all know now, that's not how it happened, and less people have a pension every year, and more, people either don't have anything or they get shoved into a 401k. So that was the first thing. So I hope I explained that well. Second question was a good one here. How can individuals support the establishment of good retirement plans for all workers in New York?
Vote, yes. Vote. I would say, I think talking about retirement and encouraging people to start whatever savings plan, I think all of this work actually starts really early. I think, we need to invest in job training. We need to invest in, for new immigrants, we need to invest in ESL. We need to teach people about banking, about credit. That can't happen when they're, 50 years old, 60 years old. It needs to happen very early. And the more people have access to better jobs, the faster they're going to get out, work their way up the economic run. So I think these are the investments that we really need to make. And we do have to engage our elected officials to say, where are you on this thing, right? Like, where are you on the increasing the minimum wage? Where are you on not having punitive small, regulations for small businesses? Where are you on? And, there are tons of questions that we can ask. But, I think we need to pay attention. And more than ever, I think there's tremendous awareness about civic participation activities. And perhaps this is the right time for us to talk about these things.
Yeah, definitely getting involved in organizing. There are so many groups around the city working on economic and racial justice issues that no matter where you live, there's somewhere where you can join in and work on this and, press for solutions both to the retirement-specific issues and the larger questions of racial and economic justice that we've been talking about here today.
And I just think that it does start with some basic questions when policies are being made either by elected officials governing a whole host of different issues. We have to ask the question, how is this going to affect workers, and how is this going to help them provide for their daily needs that they have and for their families, and then of course for retirement security, because people aren't asking those questions all the time. And it's obvious because we're in the situation that we're in today, and we're having discussions like this. You're right. It does come down to money and wages, and having more of it, and then having hopefully an employer who's willing to help their workers to plan for their retirement, or a government that is willing to help their citizens plan for retirement. We're fortunate that we have elected officials here in the city and the state who are trying to do that and supporting that. But we have to make sure that all of us in our individual positions are out there talking about the need to address and to fix this crisis, which is coming at us, not in a way that I think 10 years ago people really thought was going to be as serious as it is today.
Okay. Another question here. Are there expenses with a 401k or a 403b plan that dissuade employers from setting them up? And are there any incentives available for employers to set them up?
That's a technical question. I'm not an expert on that. If somebody wanted to certainly take that. But I've heard from some small employers, I know, we mentioned that there are some unionized workers who don't have, just because of the nature of the sectors in which they work and are represented, they don't have 401k. And we do hear, generally speaking, that there are these impediments. I would not care to comment exactly what those are, but I know that certainly they say it's cost and administration and fees of setting up plans. And I think that's what some of the goals were with Secure Choice, to be able to address that, which we'll certainly do.
Right. I mean, I would add that I think a couple of the issues that kick in is small businesses tend to have less resources. I mean, even people available to deal with this. A lot of small businesses don't, say, have a dedicated small human resources department, right? And the other thing that kicks in is that at the 401k level, certainly, the expenses for running them tend to fall more on small businesses than on larger businesses, in part because they simply don't either have the know-how to get the lower fees. There's, there's a certain amount of, you have less people enrolling, so it costs more. And there's just a long history, frankly, of small businesses, really getting sold on stuff that isn't particularly, inexpensive or easy to explain to workers. When I did Pound Foolish, there was, I actually went to a presentation on selling 401k plans to small businesses, and it was kind of actually sort of horrifying. It was both a huge amount of plans that were very high expense, and then the kicker is they were telling the retirement sellers of these plans who had come to this conference, how to look up the expenses that businesses were paying on plans so that they could pitch theirs at a slightly lower price point, which I guess on one level is quite good. I mean, but on the other hand, it was like, wow, this is cynical. So I think that's also a factor. And this then becomes just a huge confusing mess, I think, for a lot of these people. If any of you have thoughts on that, or I could just move on. But I think that becomes a problem. So the next question is also sort of technical question. How does the Secure Choice Plan work? Is it state or private sector administration, and what are the fees going to be?
Any experts on?
If somebody wants to jump up, I can't answer that either. So
I'm just going to jump up and say that Beth did talk about the condition of folks that would come together and make those decisions. And obviously what we've seen in other states is that once you have that board together, they then put out the RFPs and put out, here's the kind of plan we want for our state. And then obviously different folks are bidding on that. So one of the things we've really tried to do in the states that are up and running or about to be up and running is really trying to bring that fee schedule down to something that's very manageable. So I think we started with less than 100 basis points, which is about 1%, which is 1%. And again, we're hoping that as more states get into this and more of the financial service industry start managing these with the state, we'll see that number come down and down and down. At the same time, we hope the number of what people are putting in their own individual accounts will go up over time. But again, a lot of the decisions in terms of what the fee structure will be, what types of plans will be offered, that's something that the board itself will work together to try to figure out what are sort of the best industry standards and sort of bumpers on each side so that you can keep people protected, getting the chance to build as much as possible at the lowest fee structure possible.
And just, go ahead.
One of the joys about working with AARP is to acknowledge that we at the New School with others, the labor movement and AARP, are working on two roads. On one level, we want retirement security for all Americans, but we are doing what American social policy advocates do, is work often state by state. So we have California, Oregon, Washington State, the list of other states, the newest one now is New York, doing what we have to do for our citizens. But we are in a bigger country. And so the hope, the vision, is that the plan here in New York and the other states become federal, that we need a retirement plan that sits on top of an expanded Social Security system that is universal. It's mandated that everybody save on top of that, and not just out of their wages, but from their employer contributions, we haven't been able to negotiate that at even the state level, and also through a revised and reformed tax system, so that 70% of the tax breaks that go to Americans to save doesn't just go to the top 20%. May I just summarize that the system we have now works best for people at the top. It has failed over the 40 years for people middle class and below. And so we're doing what we can state by state, like Romney Care did in Massachusetts, like we did at state level unemployment insurance, and then we hope to lift it up as brothers and sisters in arms together to have a federal solution. But so at the state level, we're working out who's covered, who has to be covered, who's going to manage it. But really the vision is all of us to have a federal system.
Okay, and just for comparison, you talked about 100 basis points. What is the typical 401k now for a large employer? Does anybody know? I know it's less than there now, I think. Right. Yeah, and I should say that's a huge fall off, actually. When I started working on Pound Foolish, it was still over 1% at the time, which was around 2010, right?
The fees are the least of it.
Right.
Actually. It's also these portfolios are in these retail plans. And as you said, every New Yorker knows wholesale's better than resale.
Right. And the other thing I should say is I think the long-term hope is that it comes towards the greatest plan of them all, the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, which is in infinitesimal fractions. A few years ago, I did a story where I think I called up a bunch of retirement experts from the right to the left, and everyone agreed that this was the best retirement savings plan outside of a pension ever. I couldn't believe it, because you could never get anybody to agree on this, on anything, right, from the right to the left. And this was something everyone agreed on. So, as he said, the federal government plan that's open to federal employees. Yeah. So, like, your member of Congress, for instance, can, like, save their money there.
The best plan.
Yeah, right. We should get Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to start tweeting about that. But, are you? Oh, we'll talk. Okay. So, anyway, okay, so next question. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are critical components of about 90% of all individuals' financial plans in retirement. What is the fate of these programs over the next 10 to 20 years if nothing is done now, if anybody wants to try to take this on? And if not, we can move on if you feel this is too far. I will only say that whenever somebody tells me Social Security is going bankrupt, I say this is not true. I get attacked by I get constantly asked this question. So I actually wrote a column about it a few months ago because I was so tired of answering it. I should bring it with me now. It's that there needs to be some changes in the financing, and that even if there are no changes, the program will still exist. Albeit in a slightly lesser fashion potentially. But ultimately, if you make some small changes in things like the payroll tax cap and higher incomes, it will be fine. And I think that people need to know this. And I'm happy to talk more about it afterwards. After this, I don't want it to take over the panel. Okay. One of the questions that came up, or one of the things that was talked about on the panel, was affordable housing. Zoning is a huge problem. How do you find incentives for affordable housing? Has anybody given this subject thought? How do we get people to think out, both in the voting population, that we need more affordable housing? How do they get them to ask for it? And how do we get politicians to potentially be more likely to support it?
I mean, isn't it consensus in our city that we need affordable housing? I mean, you know, that's the number one crisis in our community, and all of this rezoning is happening. But, you know, and then there's all this trade-off. Oh, mandatory inclusionary zoning, voluntary inclusionary zoning. Where, you know, you're gonna get to, in my neighborhood, Williamsburg, Greenpoint, right? So they build these luxury towers, and they said, oh, we're gonna, do 20%, the 80-20 plan, right? But the poor people have to go live over here. They have the poor door, right? Like, there is all of this housing. We need to have a housing equity conversation, but nothing is getting built. All my senior nonprofit, all the senior serving nonprofits, as I mentioned before, one thing they say is like, can you figure out how to build affordable housing? It's like, just short of me winning the lottery, I can't build anything for you, right? And it really needs to be HUD-driven. It needs to be governor. It needs to be the mayor. But we keep asking it for it. But how do we really make that a priority? And I think it really does come to organizing. And lately we have been screaming for it, but things are moving slowly. And I think the challenge in New York City also is, it's not like we have a ton of land. So where are you going to build it? There's lots of interesting conversations, and then people call and say, so my nonprofit things, we want to build affordable housing here at XYZ. And my comment is like, well, that's a brownfield, right? Like, how are you going to remediate that and the cost? And so I think there just needs to be a lot of conversations around this, which we are having, but, supply and demand, and I think, the supply will, the demand will always exceed supply. So how do we, I think that we can continue to push the elected officials, but, we'll see. And then we also see issues like NYCHA, where there are all of these problems that they need to fix. And I'll just leave it there.
And just to chime in briefly on the organizing and some exciting things that are happening around affordable housing. Obviously, one of the other big problems with the existing models of affordable housing is that many of the subsidies expire and housing is no longer affordable after a certain number of years. And so there's been a lot of energy in New York City around community land trusts and other forms of non-speculative housing to try to actually take land out of the public market, increase community control, and create long-term affordable rental housing there. And that's something that's been growing over the last few years and that we're really excited about.
And I would just only add that I think that the more that we can incentivize the creation of good jobs with higher wages, that lessens the crisis of affordability with housing. So that's something that, number one, we have to certainly continue to do. And then affordable housing is, with constructing affordable housing and incentivizing affordable housing, these are complex ratios and formulas and land that's involved in it. But we want to make sure that the subsidies that the government is given to these developers, and that they're creating good jobs and they're creating adequate amount of housing, certainly for the community, but that there is a balance to that. And sometimes there isn't always a balance to that, because we see that there still is this great need which exists, certainly, for housing in our communities, yet at the same token, we see these quite often many developers who have been extraordinarily benefiting from these incentives and a lot of these different various programs and incentives which exist in affordable housing, that it just seems at times that there's a little bit of an imbalance between the kind of jobs that they're creating and the kind of housing that they're creating for communities, with the benefits that they're receiving at times.
And I think if you say, I want to build luxury housing, and we need to have zoning change, and so therefore obviously you're going to be able to get some benefits. What's the teeth we're going to put in place to say you better build it, right? Because I keep wondering, like, if I'm a developer, I'm going to say I'm going to build all this housing, and what if I just take my sweet time and I don't build it, and several administrations later, what's going to happen to me? So I think we do need to think about what's the enforcement mechanism to say, like, you build it simultaneously, or whatever needs to happen. I think that's the one issue that we all talk about, affordable housing, and Amazon's coming and they're going to need housing. What's going to happen? There's a lot of conversations that we need to start to have around this issue.
And as well as, the enforcement of existing rent laws, right? Which is also something of an issue. Okay, so another question. This was actually a really good one that occurred to me too. Why would a union member not have access to a retirement plan? How could that happen?
Well, there's a few reasons. One is some industries just don't. Some industries, the economics of certain industries just don't support it. I mean, we can go. As I said, there's 300. There's almost 300 unions. They represent people in various industries. Some more traditionally, we talked about the gig economy. Some of the original gig workers were musicians. They're union members, but they work in gigs, and they don't. They have access to health benefits and retirement benefits, but those were set up by the musicians union and representation that they have, but these are the original gig economy workers. But there's certainly some industries where in food retail and other industries that just the economics of it really do not, they're not adequate enough to provide for retirement security. But I think what's more important, there are union members in there, there are union members out there. I mentioned Charter Spectrum before, and this is something to note, that there are industries which have an incredible ability to pay, and they're just choosing, because of the continued attack on working people, not to pay. I mean, they're saying we don't want to provide them with a more traditional defined benefit pension that we spoke about earlier. We want to move them and just, here's your 401k, here's 6%. We're going to take our few billion, $40 or $50 billion that they made last year, and over $100 million for their CEO, and we're going to call it a day. So that's, I think, so there are both union members who traditionally haven't had them, but there are, I don't want to also discount and forget about those who had these good pensions for years and who are under attack for different reasons.
Okay. Anybody else, or I think you've more or less answered that. It's become really common to tell workers to delay taking Social Security and work longer. Is this a good idea, or are there barriers to doing that? Anybody want to take that on?
Look, I would say that folks who work in construction, if you, there is a finite, our bodies were created, there's a finite amount of time that I think certain workers in certain industries can also work too. I mean, anybody who looks, I was going through the city today and you see the cold weather we're having today and somebody running a jackhammer, you try to do that for 30 years. After a while, your body starts to break down. Maybe you could do something for a little while, but I don't think that we want to create conditions where people are having to work as long as they are today because they have no choice, okay? Because they're employers and because we've kind of had this shift in society where in this balance of power, shifting towards, corporations and the wealthy and the powerful in society, and that's where it seems like a lot of the wealth and income tends to go these days. So I think at the same token, if somebody wants to work, that's great. If there's an option for them to work, it's great for their dignity and for their soul to certainly be out there working, but that's not what we're seeing today. We're seeing people have no choice. They're working because they have to, because they realize that the two options are either, retire into poverty or work until they die. Literally, for many of them. I mean, it sounds dramatic, but that's the truth for many, many people. They have no choice. Or move in, with a relative if they can find a relative that they could share a room with. Right? Yeah.
Okay.
What?
My retirement plan is prison.
Yeah.
Bank robbery? Okay, anyway, I'm being told I have to wrap up, so I want to ask our panelists, before I do that, if there's anything we didn't address that you'd like to address, or if you have any thoughts, quick closing remarks.
We're good.
Okay.
I would just say that we need to think about all the different invisible hands that make the city run. Some of them don't get paid the wages that they should. Some of them are never going to get to retire, and they will always be poor. And that's the conversation we need to have. And I think we recognize the people on top, but unless we start to think about bringing up the people who work in those invisible economies and in those low-wage jobs that have to travel 2 hours one way to go do their minimum wage job and making couple bucks an hour, I think, that's where the conversation needs to start. Like, who really helps to run this city? And it's the people who will never get to retire because they don't have a choice. So.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I need to, I want to say thank you to our panel, who were just terrific. And I am going to turn this over to Teresa Ghilarducci and Beth Finkel again, so that you can just close and give some parting remarks.
Let's do it together. I want to thank you for coming, and through your questions, I understand that and you want to do something about it. I want to give a shout out to the people that work on my team who are working hard to do the numbers to help any advocates in the room do your work. So the people who work at the Relab, will you raise your hands? We have, look at this. All researchers and all communications experts. So I hope that you can meet them. And so thank you for being here. And Beth?
I want to thank everyone. This was really very thoughtful. I took a lot of notes. I think the research is so impactful for us. There's a lot of opportunities out there for us. There's a lot of policy opportunities and the overlap of affordable housing, but also the overlap of the cost burden of housing and how we can look at that. And I know we're looking at deed theft, we're looking at predatory lending, payday lending, all those issues. What are the options for people for financing in the community? And I think we need to delve more into that the next time around. I also want to thank our staff. I particularly want to thank Kristen McManus. Kristen, would you please stand, because she really took responsibility for this and was great. And for ARP staff and volunteers, and particularly for Leo Asen, who is our state president, who's here, who's kind of the head of our board for New York, and I really thank him for his efforts in his direction too. So thank you all. You'll be hearing from us again because I think there's a lot of opportunities here. So thank you, Teresa.
Thank you. And again, have a good night.